Zcam E2-S6 cinema camera. It has a Super35 sensor featuring dual native ISO with up to 14 stops of dynamic range. It shoots 6K 12-bit ProRes RAW over HDMI. It has USB-C ports, control ports, Ethernet ports, Wi-Fi ports, remote ports, storage ports, power ports, audio in ports, audio out ports, and video ports, with a few buttons thrown in for good measure. All inside a camera package that weighs just over 2 pounds and costs $2,500. Now, you might be asking yourself, why this camera? And that's a perfectly reasonable question. The answer is that despite the fact that it has an almost obscene amount of features, there's one that seems to have flown a bit under the radar. You see, the sensor on the S6 is, near as makes no difference, flush with the rest of the body, which means that you can take the mounting plate off to use whatever lenses you have natively instead of having to use an adapter. Why this interests me is that it's going to give us a very rare glimpse of something that, as far as I can tell, hasn't been tested, and that's what it's like to use micro four thirds lenses on a Super 35 sensor. Now, there is a big asterisk here I feel I have to mention. The glaring problem with this combination is that most native micro four thirds lenses have a very small rear element, which means that when you put it on a big sensor like a Super 35 sensor, it creates vignetting. And right away, that means most micro four thirds lenses are not going to be suitable for this in anything but a cropped 4K mode, making the move to a 6K sensor kind of pointless. However, there are a set of lenses that don't suffer from this issue. The Voigtlander Micro Four Thirds lens set. Now, this set consists of my own 10.5mm, 17.5mm, 25mm, 42.5mm, 60mm, and 75mm. Now, this review has gone through several different iterations, mostly me trying to figure out which aspects I wanted to cover. And since there are so many videos out there that give you the tech talk spec talk, I decided that it was going to be best to cover these 4 topics: low light sensitivity, usable dynamic range, Zcam color science, and lens coverage and performance. And in order to test them out, I set up a few scenes that will hopefully paint you a picture of what it's like to use these micro four thirds lenses on a Super 35 sensor in the real world. So first, let's talk about the performance of the Voigtlanders concerning the Super 35 sensor. If you have watched any of my previous videos, you'll know that I consider the Voigtlanders some of the top lenses in the Micro Four Thirds system. But putting these lenses on a system they aren't designed for could lead to some interesting optical issues like vignetting. But another issue is resolving ability. At 6K ProRes RAW, I will admit I was a bit concerned if the lenses were going to lose sharpness and clarity. And when opened up, there is a noticeable loss of sharpness at the edges of the lens, to the point where sometimes it's difficult to tell if it's actually in focus, even if the center is in focus. But when stopped down to f2 or greater, this effect mostly disappears and is still extremely usable. But as a whole, even with the addition of an enlarged image area, the lenses still remain mostly sharp and are able to resolve higher resolutions than what we've seen available on Micro Four Thirds. Another flaw that is exacerbated is the noticeable shift in tint from green to purple when stopping down or opening up the aperture. Except, unlike on Micro Four Thirds camera, there's a very clear circular gradient that darkens the more you move further from the center. And what this actually is, what you're seeing, is the uncharted areas of the lens. These lenses weren't designed to cover this large of a sensor, and as such weren't given the same kind of rigorous testing that Voigtlander, or Cosina in this case, usually put their lenses through. One of the other major changes is the depth of field. Now that these super fast lenses have been able to really open up, it was such a unique sight to see just how shallow the depth of field was actually able to get when the shot called for it. And while there are a lot of technical bits you could go into, when filming something in the middle of nowhere, the last thing I'm really worried about is doing math to figure out what an equivalent depth of field is. Along with the changes to the depth of field, there are considerable changes to the field of view. Since the Zcam S6 uses a Super35 sensor, the crop factor is moved to 1.5x instead of 2x compared to full frame. The only lens that was not available for this review was the Voigtlander 29mm f0.8, but if you want to check out my review for that, you can find it on my channel. Performance-wise, the ability to get a wider field of view across the board for no extra investment and still retain the look and build quality, it's going to be staggeringly hard to beat going forward. Alright, usable dynamic range. This one is going to bleed into color science a little bit since this clearly isn't a studio-controlled test of dynamic range. I admit I'm always a little incredulous about dynamic range claims, as I've always likened it to gas mile adjustments. This film was particularly challenging due to the changing daylight and mixture of hot spots and shadows from the foliage. Not every situation is going to yield the same results that you would get in a sterile lab setting, so it's important to be able to see this in multiple environments. This sensor is purported to have 14 stops of dynamic range, and after playing with this raw footage from the Atomos, I can tell a marked difference from the GH5 to the Zcam. I've used the Panasonic S1H and Vericam LT, which also have 14 stops of dynamic range, but using ProRes RAW with the Zcam, it feels like there's a slight edge to this footage in terms of highlight and shadow recoverability, which is really lovely to have in post. Now, I'm not the type of DP who needs to have absolutely every highlight or shadow level inside the range at all times, as I feel it can lead to a relatively boring image. But trying to balance tastefully blown highlights versus crushing the shadows becomes a bit of a tricky balancing act when these scenes could easily go either way, with just a third of a stop over or under. However, the extra latitude made for a much easier path to getting correct exposure. In order to really push the exposure, there were a few times that I tried overexposing by 3+ stops just to see what I was able to recover, and I was pretty blown away by what data still remained intact. It also made for easy work when reining in the highlights when the lights brushed across a character's face. All in all, while I can't say for sure that the Zcam provides the full 14 stops across the board, what I do feel confident in saying is that in a run and gun scenario, there is plenty of leeway to correct any exposures or mistakes. So let's talk about the low light sensitivity. For this particular scene, we have filmed at 1250 ISO and 5000 ISO. The dual gain ISO is standard at 400 for the low and 1250 for the high, which, if I'm being honest, doesn't actually seem like that big of a gap. For a comparison, the higher native ISO on the F6, the full frame version of this camera, is 400 over 2500, and the GH5S is the same. But for this, I specifically filmed at 1250 and up, and in some cases underexposed the image on purpose to see what noise resulted when corrected. After grading this particular scene, unless you really want to see ultra clean, sterile footage, there's no real need for denoising. The grain is hardly visible, and the noise that is there has a very subtle presence. In fact, I actually had to add grain back just to get some texture. I'm also glad to see that even at the higher gain, the dynamic range and colors don't seem to suffer very much. I wasn't really sure what to expect in terms of sensor performance. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't setting up any preconceived expectations, so I didn't research the sensor very thoroughly outside of making sure people hadn't covered the same topic I was covering. What did surprise me was that I didn't need to open the aperture up anywhere near what I thought I was going to need to. I specifically created this scene because I was really hoping to show off more of what the lenses would look like at f0.95. But with the dual gain ISO and the lighting elements I set up, not only was I able to keep the f-stop between f1.4 and f4 the majority of the time, I had to in order to keep the exposure in check without the addition of ND filters. There were a few shots at f0.5, but overall I'm pretty thankful I didn't have to run Steadicam and pull focus at f0.95 by hand all night. The benefit of using the Zcam S6 over the GH5 in this low light situation are very apparent, as the GH5 simply cannot compete maxing out at around 1600 ISO, requires denoising, and usually loses 2 stops of dynamic range when pushed. However, the GH5S, on the other hand, has the same high gain ISO that the Zcam does, but only without the benefit of 6K RAW. In my opinion, I still think the GH5S would be comparable to the Zcam in terms of sensor noise, so the benefits of the S6 are somewhat lessened in this category. Alright, let's jump into color. The scenes were filmed with the Atomos Ninja V in 6K ProRes RAW, which is more accurately 5.8K. I'll have more to say on ProRes RAW in a moment. Now, I've shot with a lot of different cameras over the years, and I have no shame in saying that for the kind of projects I like working on, Panasonic has been my go-to for color. I find the Vlog and Vlog L incredibly easy to work with, and the colors that it produces are extremely realistic and natural. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure whether it was the Zcam, the recording in ProRes RAW, or that I've just never seen good footage from the Zcam, but I am extremely impressed with the color. I don't consider myself a colorist in any sense of the word, so I'm certain there's more to be squeezed out of these images, especially since I grade in Premiere. ProRes RAW obviously has benefits for color, but even still, I didn't really expect the range to be so expansive. Alright, so I'm going to briefly touch on ProRes RAW and the Z-Log. Now, this was my first time shooting on the Atomos and my first time shooting ProRes RAW. I don't know who is responsible for the handicap ProRes options in Premiere, but only having exposure control and a baked-in color space with no available option to see the actual RAW footage is kind of a slap in the face when you realize the only way to utilize the benefits of ProRes RAW is in Final Cut Pro. I'm sure that I'm not alone in feeling this, but whether it's Apple or Adobe, I say this with all due respect, this is infuriating. And it really, really makes me question whether or not I ever want to shoot in ProRes RAW ever again. Now, I didn't mess around with it too much, but Z-Log RAW has a very strange implementation where instead of having the options under the source footage like you would with Redcode RAW or ProRes RAW, you have to download a tool and add the control options for Z-Log RAW as a video effect. And I think that's a rather unique way to do it. Maybe it's not as streamlined, but I love the idea of it, since it's unbelievable how many options this gives you as compared to ProRes RAW, which is frankly a bit embarrassing for ProRes. And I would really love to see this kind of implementation for Panasonic cameras in the future. My main concern was going to be whether or not the Zcam had a look that needed extra work in post to be corrected or matched. But I don't see any kind of yellow or red cast, which I've seen on other systems, which leaves me feeling confident, knowing that if I decide to use this on a paid shoot, that I can trust the system to deliver a flexible image. Okay, here's a little bonus. Now, normally I like to let these scenes play as a whole, but because we're reviewing the color here, I'm going to select a few shots to show you the before and after. This is the ungraded image with the recommended Vlog color space. Then we bring it back into 709, give it a custom creative LUT, then temperature, the tint, the exposure, contrast, highlights, the shadows, the blacks, the saturation, curves, the grain, and there you have it, the final grade. And here's another example. Again, we take it into its raw form with its color space set to Vlog. Then we bring it back into Rec 709. We add our custom creative LUT, our temperature, tint, exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, saturation, grain, and there's the final grade. Overall, this camera has some really solid benefits, from the dynamic range, the color science, the decent low light performance, and of course the interchangeable lens mount. My only critique that I didn't mention during the review is on the next version of this camera, I would love to see an SDI port instead of these strange 4-pin breakout control ports. Right, so where does that leave us? Well, the way I see it is on one side you have Panasonic releasing the BGH1 and finally announcing the GH6. And on the other side you have the Red Komodo, and if you want to be generous, the Sony FX3 and Canon C70. With the S6 almost being 2 years old now, it puts Zcam in a bit of a pinch and means it has real competition going forward. Earlier, I had talked about different iterations for this review, and one of them was an idea on what would happen if Panasonic had decided to leave Micro Four Thirds behind in favor of the full-frame lineup. With Panasonic being extremely tight-lipped about their future, and with Olympus being sold off completely, it looked like the end of Micro Four Thirds could have been a real possibility. But with Zcam not only having a Micro Four Thirds camera, but also creating a native mount for their Super 35 sensor and even their full-frame cameras, I actually felt a huge sense of relief, knowing that with the swap of a mount, I could continue to use the lenses that I've come to love over the last decade of filmmaking. I'd like to give a huge shout out and thank you to Cause Music, who composed the music for Jungle Buds and for parts of the review. Please go check out his YouTube channel here. I'd also like to thank Dylan Jones for composing the music for the lighter short and Keenan Carey for playing guitars on the opening intro. I also want to thank Matt Poitras for letting me come out and film with him and his crew. I want to thank Eric Rousseau, Anna Schatte, and Danielle Ploeger for making my fear and loathing dreams come true. You can find all of their social media handles in the description below. As for me, if you want to see more behind the scenes photos or videos, scripts, extended cuts of the shorts, or just want to support future videos, please visit my Patreon here. Every little bit helps, and see you on the next one.